want to welcome everyone. It's June, and we have a series today, tomorrow, and Wednesday in terms of virtual learning with our webinars, and it's looking at policy and government, but most importantly, a conversation and guest speakers that address things that we are developing outside the Beltway. As you know, we are launching at Emerald Cities a national grassroots campaign. And this campaign has a two-tier approach. One is inside the Washington Beltway in terms of building momentum for our issues and policies with the administration, with Congress, with alliances throughout the country, but nationally based. And then the second part is outside the Beltway, which is you. You are the local leaders in our cities. We want to build that momentum and your leadership as a part of social capital to make a difference. So although we're looking and talking and having this session from Washington, D.C., all the policy development and movement and advocacy really lies with you. And today we're going to start our first of 3 days with a federal legislative update. And we're very happy and pleased and honored to have Sonia Ramirez, who's Deputy Director of Government Affairs at the AFL-CIO's Building and Construction Trades Department. Sonia has a very, very impressive resume in terms of working in national legislation. Prior to serving in her position, she worked 6 years with the AFL-CIO as their registered lobbyist, and she has really expansive time actually on Capitol Hill, having worked for Representatives Eleanor Holmes Norton and Representative Ciro Rodriguez. So today she's going to talk about what's in play in terms of federal legislation. But most importantly, we want to figure out in terms of devolution how federal legislation devolves and really makes sense in terms of what you're doing in your respective cities, in terms of utility reform, in terms of workforce development, in terms of community benefit agreements, overall policies that really will drive our campaign. And so, Sonia, you're on.
Hello, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining this first innovation in sort of linking Washington, D.C. to folks out into the field for Emerald Cities. I principally lobby on project labor agreements for the Building and Construction Trades Department, and certainly all of you recognize that there is a very important link between project labor agreements, community workforce agreements, community benefit agreements, and the important work that Emerald Cities is doing every day to develop our workforce, to increase important channels, pipelines into the skilled trades, and preserving project labor agreements and having project labor agreements accessible both in the private and in the public sector is an important piece of the work that we all sort of share here. Just to sort of get our conversation started, my first slide sort of just lays out what a project labor agreement is. So a project labor agreement, as we all know, is a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement that is is put in place to enhance efficiency and quality of a construction project. These type of agreements facilitate the completion of a project by establishing the terms and conditions of employment and a framework for cooperation that all workers and their respective crafts involved in a construction project are to be committed to. These agreements can also very significantly feature the engagement of communities in trying to reach community goals on a particular project in a community. So these project labor agreements, community workforce agreements, and from this point forward I'm just going to call them PLAs, are an important mechanism in place at the federal level in order to really tap resources that will help us all achieve our goals in terms of workforce development. In recent days, I don't have to be the first to tell you that both in Congress as well as in state legislatures across the country, these type of agreements have been the subject of debate and have been targeted by anti-union groups as the source of a lot of legislative battles. So when we are on the Hill advocating for project labor agreements, I think there are two really important pieces that are frequently misunderstood about PLAs. One is that our opponents suggest that PLAs exclude union workers, both on the project itself as well as in the bid solicitation process for union contractors. As we all know, the PLA model does not mandate or predetermine a workforce to be union alone. And in fact, the PLA is sort of the source for dictating the ratios of which employees are going to work on that particular project. So that is part of what the PLA is able to accommodate if, you know, a non-union contractor were to receive a bid. The other common misconception is that at the federal level that President Obama has issued an executive order that mandates PLAs on federal projects. Just to be clear, President George Bush issued an executive order that clearly prohibited the use of PLAs on construction projects. And, you know, when that ban was in place, it really harmed many of our trades from being able to successfully work on government projects. When President Obama was elected, he lifted those restrictions and replaced them with a policy that encouraged federal agencies to consider the use of PLAs when they do construction projects at the $25 million or above range. Those are sort of the facts in place. They are commonly misrepresented. They are commonly abused in terms of elected officials misrepresenting these facts. Sort of going back to the source of where these misconceptions come, we need to look back at the executive order that President Obama issued, Executive Order 13502. In that executive order, it clearly states that executive agencies may, on a project-by-project basis, require the use of project labor agreements by a contractor where use of such an agreement will advance the federal government's interest in achieving economy and efficiency in federal procurement. It goes on to say in Section 4 that any project labor agreement reached pursuant to this order shall bind all contractors and subcontractors on a construction project through the inclusion of the appropriate specifications of the project labor agreement in all relevant solicitations for the bid. So the executive order recognizes that the effective way to achieve a project labor agreement is to require the project labor agreement to be part of the bid specifications. Now, Congress has voted 5 times now on project labor agreements. And in fiscal year 2012, we saw 3 attempts, actually 2 attempts and 1 restoration vote on project labor agreements. So these are the listed amendments. We saw the first on the continuing resolution bill, H.R. 1, by Mr. Ginta, followed by the first appropriation effort to restrict funds based on project labor agreements, and that was offered by Mr. Scalise. We also had an amendment that was offered in committee before it reached the House floor on the military construction bill, and that in-committee vote was able to be made part of the military construction bill last fiscal year. So Steve LaTourette, a Republican from Ohio, offered an amendment to remove that language, and in fact we were able to be successful in removing that harmful language, and we were able to win the first 2 efforts to restrict project labor agreements. Most recently, we have seen, again, these type of attempts to undermine PLAs in the appropriation cycle. And the first effort that we saw underway was advanced by Roscoe Bartlett, a Republican from Maryland, who had an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that we actually considered on the House floor 2 weeks ago. This was our first defeat on project labor agreements, and it was a really stinging defeat because we actually lost that vote by only 2 votes, and we had 8 Democratic absences, and one of our Republican supporters was absent for that vote as well. So it was a really stinging and very close defeat. Once again, we had some troubling project labor agreement language that was offered in committee on the military construction bill, just as had been attempted in the previous fiscal year, and it had, been advanced and been made part of the underlying bill. And so on the House floor, Michael Grimm, a Republican from New York, offered an amendment to strike that language from the military construction bill, and this is sort of the big highlight of my presentation today, which is to announce to you that we had a very decisive victory on this last effort, which resulted in a 218 to 198 victory to remove harmful, restrictive project labor agreement language. So how do we win these floor debates, and how are we able to preserve PLAs as an option at the federal level? Quite frankly, we do it with bipartisan support. Given the dynamics and the political realities that are part of the House currently, no one is going to win a legislative battle without eliciting the support of Republicans. So, this is a listing of the 5 PLA votes that we have had, and the Republican members that have consistently voted with us for either 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1 of those votes. I have highlighted and underlined the members of Congress that come from states that are represented by Emerald Cities. And I think it's important for us to recognize that, this is a pretty interesting list, and I think it gives us some sense of, areas of the country that have high union density, that are concerned about job creation and job access for our membership. And, I think many of these folks have important political considerations in contemplating whether they're going to support the building trades on this effort and put folks to work. So I just think it's an important and interesting dynamic. Getting 34 Republicans to support an initiative in a bipartisan fashion where we only lose consistently 1 Democrat and the rest of the caucus votes with us is a pretty uncommon phenomena given what's going on currently in our political state of affairs. In addition to and complementing our efforts to bring Republicans to the table to join Democrats in supporting PLAs, an important dynamic is coalition work. And so we work collaboratively with our contractor associations who understand the benefits of PLAs and understand the importance and significance of workforce development efforts. We work collaboratively with our community partners, and actually I think we should do a better job of working collaboratively with community partners to make the case that PLAs are the most useful tool to create inroads to the skilled crafts. And we should continue to push in that regard. Certainly working collaboratively with the AFL-CIO and the unions of the building trades, we are able to really have a legislative voice, give a legislative voice to this issue. The building trades have a council infrastructure that exists across the country, and many times these elected officials, while they may not have a direct relationship with us nationally, they certainly have a relationship with their local councils. And in some instances, these elected members of Congress have helped these councils get PLA projects. And they've written letters to agencies or to other folks to ensure that, they're making the case for PLAs where they can. And certainly our industry partners who recognize that, in order to achieve success on the job, they're going to need to get work. And in order to support the apprenticeship and the training portion of what the building trades do, they're going to need to put their membership to work. So industry partners are very helpful as well in this endeavor. And then certainly, telling the success stories of PLAs and CWAs where they exist, and making sure that we're continuing to, make the case for value on display in high road construction, and how really investing in training the talent of the future is the way to go. We need to continue to do those stories. Now, one quick thing about these recent legislative initiatives that we've seen is that they have attempted to undermine PLAs in an indirect way. What they have said is that they would not restrict or encourage project labor agreements, but they would disallow federal agencies from requiring PLAs in any solicitation, bid specification, or controlling documents for a project. So they don't outright say, as in previous attempts in the last fiscal year, they just simply defunded the executive order outright. What these efforts have done is, in a really sneaky type of legislative maneuver, they have tried to suggest that they are actually being neutral on the language, and that they are simply restricting the government from implying within bid solicitations that a PLA would be a useful tool on a particular project. So in both of the recent votes that we saw, that very similar language was used, as I said, that really specifically cited the use of bid specifications and controlling documents that would disallow the federal government from requiring use of PLAs on a particular project. Now, if the federal government wants to invest or decides that a project labor agreement is a useful tool on a particular project, and they consider and contemplate the criteria that was outlined in the executive order, then they should be able to, within the bid specifications, in practice, be able to implement the project labor agreement by making the solicitations very clear to contractors that are bidding to that particular bid, to say that in order to work on this project, you need to comply with the project labor agreement, and you need to comply with the requirements that are made part of the project labor agreement. And these legislative proposals, they bar federal agencies from using PLAs on the projects by prohibiting them from including that very specific language. Now, this is not unfamiliar to us, because this approach is exactly the approach that was used by the Bush administration to ban PLAs when they issued their executive order. They restricted the use of PLAs being deliberately mentioned in bid specifications. So this is exactly the mechanism that the Bush administration used to prohibit use of PLAs at the federal level. We have also seen this very similar language used in the states. So the point of a PLA is that it enables an entity to control that particular construction project by establishing project-wide terms. So it requires that everyone working on that site abide by its terms. If it doesn't do that, then it wouldn't be a project labor agreement. So what has been found by the states, and in the state of Michigan, they passed a restrictive project labor agreement legislative piece of legislation, and it was, the point of litigation. And in litigation, U.S. District Court Judge Victoria Roberts struck down the Michigan law, claiming that it would effectively interfere with the rights of workers under the National Labor Relations Act to act together to convince state and local agencies as well as private sector developers to utilize PLAs. And in rejecting Michigan's claim that its law was intended to further its economic interests, Judge Roberts noted that state lawmakers had never demonstrated that PLAs increased the cost to Michigan taxpayers. So the court found and enjoined the Michigan law, stating that governmental units were free now to enter into PLAs when they determined on an individual basis that it was in their best interest. Kansas, Louisiana, Maine, and Nebraska have also passed similar types of legislative efforts to restrict use of PLAs, And then there are 4 additional states that have just outright banned use of PLAs at the state level. So we are facing the same sort of legislative battle in the states. There are now 9 states that have restrictive PLA laws. So I think in terms of what do we do now, and what are the next steps, and what do we have to do to preserve PLAs as an option at the federal level, I think we certainly have to tell our story about this victory. Certainly, as I said, and I need to highlight one more time, that getting 34 Republicans in one of the most conservative houses we've ever seen in Congress to deliver a decisive victory of 218 to 198 with a consistently growing margin of Republicans supporting PLAs is a very important message to deliver. It really makes the case that this is not a partisan issue. This is about putting people to work in quality jobs. And it really restates the fact that a strict prohibition on PLAs is essentially a government regulatory measure to undermine the competitiveness of government to make a decision on their own sound financial reasoning. I think we need to continue to watch the states to make sure that, where we see efforts to undermine the ability of states to engage and use PLAs on projects, if engaging the courts in the process is appropriate, I think we need to continue to do that so we create a very good and sound defense and a good story to tell on how these states are undermining their own interests. I think we need to continue to monitor the appropriation cycle. In fact, even though we just had this enormous victory, we anticipate future votes to restrict PLAs on both potentially the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill that is up on the House floor this week, and potentially the Homeland Security Bill that we saw offered an amendment that would have been restricted to PLAs in last year's fiscal year. So we need to remain vigilant in terms of monitoring what is going on in the appropriation cycle, in particular given that this House of Representatives really enjoys this new open rule, which allows for members to decide, they can offer any amendment at any time. And I think the other important piece is to really be proactive in the defense of PLAs and engaging all of our coalition partners and the media in telling the true story behind how effective PLAs are at really providing access to quality jobs for our members, putting our members back to work, especially given what we saw in the most recent jobs report as it relates to infrastructure investment and putting construction workers to work. And we need to continue to engage our elected officials to tell the positive stories behind PLAs, where they have come in on time, where they have come in on budget, and where they have really delivered in terms of the integrity of the structures that they are building. We need to continue to invite our elected officials to visit our apprenticeship training programs to make sure they understand the sophistication of the investment that the building trades is making to an apprenticeship program that really does train the next generation of skilled crafts folks, and that really invests in these community workforce agreements that make a commitment to the community that they will make efforts to have goals to incorporate women, veterans, minorities, so that they have a true positive impact community-wide. I think we need all ideas on the table, and we need all of our allies and stakeholders really to come through and to really help us tell the story about PLAs, both in a legislative context as well as from a very straightforward community perspective. So at this point, I think that's the end of my presentation, my formal presentation. And if folks have questions, I'm happy to go over any aspect of it.
If you are on the call, you can just simply unmute yourself if you do have a question. We can go to the cities. Atlanta, question. Cleveland. there aren't any questions, I know that Felipe wanted to, did you want to say something else?
Sure.
Yeah. And remember, you can also use the chat feature, which is located in the right-hand panel of your screen.
So from the presentation, what's really important is that the whole movement in terms of supporting project labor agreements has direct investment in terms of the work that we're doing in our cities, because many of you are working with mayors and city councils and with governors to talk about community benefits. And there is a direct correlation between community benefits, the whole concept of project labor agreements, and community workforce agreements. And again, the whole issue is, how do we make our communities whole in terms of jobs, in terms of getting those jobs that are high-road jobs that pay well with benefits, and additionally, how do we get neighborhoods and those that have been locked out of employment in the mainstream in terms of the job market. So I want to thank Sonia for taking time out to give us an overview of what's going on. And we have quite...
So it looks like you guys might not be able to unmute yourselves, but I do see that there are some questions coming in over chat. So from Stephen Gelb, who is our local director in Seattle, he asks, is there a way to get access to federal PLAs that exist in our cities? If so, who has the list?
I can tell you we have a list, and I actually thought of incorporating it into the presentation. But I can make sure you get the list. I can forward it on here and make sure that you get a copy of it. In fact, it's a very limited list, I have to be honest with you. The federal government has been very slow in responding to the executive order and incorporating the goals of the executive order into their procurement plans. And unfortunately, the executive order did not outline a procedure for each agency to incorporate those goals. So each agency has been left to its own process to create an incentive piece to incorporate PLAs, and that process has been very slow. So these defensive battles have really been to allow us the opportunity to make the case agency by agency on these projects.
We have another question from Keith Ware. We currently have our first ever Navy project labor agreement negotiated in Washington State. This will be approximately $330 million worth of work for a very hard-hit community. We need to show how they can be utilized for economic revitalization.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree, and I absolutely think that this is going to be a very important project for us to make those points, because the Department of Defense and the Army Corps of Engineers has been very slow in incorporating the PLA goal that's in the executive order. And for them to have negotiated this PLA is very important, and I absolutely agree that we need to showcase it as a model.
This is from Stephen Gelb from Seattle again. You listed the Republican members of Congress who have supported PLAs. How would you like us to follow up with them?
I would love you to thank them for deciding to side with putting our membership to work and to not allow partisan bickering to stand in the way of their commitment to quality jobs in the construction industry. I think many of us would agree that we don't agree with these members on everything, but it's important to highlight where we do agree and where it's in our mutual interest to really highlight the significance of something like having the ability to engage in a PLA that can change people's lives and change communities. So we really need to make sure that we are elevating the PLA issue, that we are reaching out to them, and that we are telling them we are watching them and that this was the right thing to do.
From K.C. Barnard in Portland, how do you suggest we handle success with PLAs and CBAs on projects that aren't green? Thus, they hit some, but not all of our goals. We have a huge Columbia River crossing project in Portland. Labor likes it, but enviros don't.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that, you know, as I said previously, in regards to the Republicans, we don't agree with these Republican members on many public policy issues, but where we agree, I think we need to stand united, and we need to highlight the core values associated with PLAs so that we are demonstrating that we are a multifaceted community and that we are diverse, and yet we still hold strong to the values and goals of PLAs, which are, you know, the values that Felipe just mentioned, which are workforce development, creating inroads to high road construction jobs, and creating construction careers for whole communities.
If anybody else?
About the environmental is not liking the project.
Okay. Yes. Do you want to say anything? Okay. We don't have any other questions on the chat. Once again, if you are on the call, it looks like you're not able to unmute yourself. So we're going to take questions through the chat feature, which is located in the right panel of your screen. And I guess I'll give you guys a couple more seconds if you want to ask any other questions to Sonia, Felipe, or anybody. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So Sonia, again, thank you so much for providing the congressional landscape in terms of what's happening up on Capitol Hill. And just to reiterate, tomorrow and Wednesday we'll continue this series because June is Government and Public Policy Month. And again, we're doing virtual learning together so that we build a strong defense in terms of what we believe in for our communities. So the next 2 days we'll be taking a look at the utility industry on Tuesday, a basic A through Z in terms of utilities, a Utility 101. And then on Wednesday looking at the whole framework of utility companies and what it means for local policy. So I want to thank everyone for participating today, and we'll be back tomorrow, same time, same station. Signing off from Emerald Cities.